Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my end of the season deep dive series where I dive into the teams and kind of compare them to the teams around where they finished in the constructor standings. And I look into the drivers to figure out where they stand on the drivers' championship and those that finished around them. And I've been going through this and starting from the back of the pack and work my way to the front of the pack and going through each team. And so this week we will be doing a deep dive into Ferrari. Now, Ferrari dropped from second place to fourth place this year, so that was kind of a downward spiral there for them. I think they were expected to be competing for that Constructors' Championship. Instead, they kind of dropped back down into that fourth place, really struggling along. And why did that cause that? Well, they only had one win, and that was in a sprint race, and Hamilton didn't get any podium positions at all in the GP races. And so that kind of hurt them right off the bat in the sense that they couldn't quite get up to where they wanted to be, competing for those wins. And why is it they couldn't compete for those wins? Well, that car had several issues that were going throughout this whole season. Some of those were like it was had a very narrow operating window, so it's hard to really dial in for each of those tracks to get it to where it was really good for those tracks. Had real rear instability, and it had a higher drive height than they wanted. They wanted it a little bit lower to get that downforce around that track. And so those things were kind of causing some issues with them trying to dial that car in on most tracks to get the most speed out of it. They did bring a mid-season suspension update, but it failed to resolve the core problem of that car. And, Hamilton, of course, came into that team, and he really struggled to get his grips on that car as well, not being able to get the most out of it along with his teammate. Charles Leclerc was able to get a little bit more out of it than Hamilton was, as he was coming in from a different team style, and he seemed to think that was been a little harder than he was expecting it to be in that environment. And of course, Ferrari had their wonderful mistakes in strategy and reliability, including a couple of double DNFs that really hurt them in those point running as well. They weren't quite able to, get the cars, in that running condition, and with those mistakes in the strategy that they really are known for, choosing that wrong strategy really hurt them as well. They couldn't quite bounce back as fast as they have in the past. They also had a little bit of tire management issues, so they had to work around those tire management, so they couldn't get the most out of those tires, which kind of put them in a little lag for those strategies for those tire swaps. And then, of course, we had the leadership come in near the end that were kind of like blaming everything, and so they weren't very supportive either, and so that kind of hurt them in the long run as well for that morale issues and how all that played in. So all of these things, played into Ferrari. Now, I don't want you to say that I'm just trying to favor Ferrari and giving them all the excuses. I think they made a lot of those bad themselves, and they had to sleep in it, and that was kind of the result of that. So hopefully the new season with all the new regulations will help them get back into grips and be fighting for those front positions. Now, if we want to dive in a little bit into those drivers, we see that Hamilton in those sprint qualifying out-qualified Charles Leclerc 2 out of the 6 times, so he's kind of struggled on those qualifying sessions, but he kind of evened it out on those sprint races, winning 3 out of the 6 sprint races against his teammate. Now, for the GP race, it was he out-qualified Charles Leclerc 5 out of the 24 times, so Charles Leclerc had a pretty good handle on those qualifying for these GP races, and he only outdid Charles Leclerc on those GP races on the final positions 4 out of the 24 times. So not a very good look for Hamilton in this run. So we'll have to see if he can bounce back, as I said, with the new car and the new regulations, and hopefully that get it more designed for his liking, where he can take around that car to get at least a little bit more competitive and be on par with his teammate. Now, if you want to do the math, or you can let me do the math here with Charles Leclerc, and he out-qualified Hamilton in those sprint qualifying 4 out of the 6 times, so that was a really good run for him. And that basically dropped back down, not quite as much, but on the sprint races, he outperformed Hamilton 3 out of the 6 times. So he won, finished ahead of Hamilton 3 out of those 6 sprint races. Now for the GP races, this is where Charles Leclerc kind of shined against Hamilton, because he out-qualified Hamilton 19 out of the 24 times in those GP qualifying sessions. And of course, that's where all the big points are. So that kind of pushed him way up on the lead on that front. And of course, he ended up in those GP races ahead of Hamilton 20 out of the 24 times. So he kind of ended up there, even though there's a couple times that Hamilton was out qualified him, he was able to get back into the lead on a couple of those occasions. So that kind of gives you that big picture of how that team was and how some of the issues that they were running. As we dive into this chart here, we can kind of see a little bit more data in that regard between the drivers and the team. And so you can see that again that they dropped down from that second position last year down to that fourth position this past year in 2025. Their average sprint qualifying position was 8.7, and they moved it up slightly to finishing on an average of an 8.3 in those sprint races. So they were in the points, but not really high in the points on average. So they were getting some points in there, but compared to the other teams, they were kind of at that back of the pack, just on the edge of dropping out of those points. Now for the GP races, they averaged a 7.4 on the qualifying positions, and they dropped back just slightly to that 7.6 marker for those finishing those GP races. So they were still in the points again, but they were at the back of the points, not getting the points that they really wanted, not fighting for those top positions in that regard. Now they had 1 DNF in the sprint race and 6 in the GP races. So that kind of played out against them as well. And if you break that down by each of the drivers, we can see Hamilton, who dropped from 7th, or actually dropped from 7th last year up to 6th this year. So he kind of improved 1 spot in this running, with Mercedes having some trouble last year, and of course he's jumping over ship, and having Ferrari having trouble this year as well. And he had an average sprint qualifying of 10.5 place, and he moved that up to 7.8 on the finishing those sprint races. So he moved up a couple of spots in those sprint races and getting up there into those point ranges, but not quite where his teammate really wanted to be in regard to fighting for those top positions. And for the GP races, he had an average 9.4 on that qualifying run, and moved that to that 8.5 on the finishing those GP races. And again, so that's one good place up, but that's not really where I want to be. That's in the back of those point markers. So they're still getting points, but not where they wanted to get the big haul of points, not fighting for those podium positions. And he had 3 of those DNFs in the GP races. So you compare him to his teammate, Charles Leclerc, who was 3rd last year, and he ended up in 5th in 2025. So that was not the greatest run for Charles Leclerc in this Ferrari when they were expecting to move forward, and he ended up moving backwards. But his average sprint qualifying position was 6.8, so a little ahead of his teammate there. He did drop back to that 8.7 on average on those the sprint races. So he dropped a position basically in that running, but still was kind of in that points on average on that run. And the qualifying for the GP races was not a lot higher up there in that 5.5 marker. And he dropped a spot to that 6.8 marker for finishing those GP races. So he was able to get up there pretty close to the front line, not quite where they wanted to be, again, not on the podium position or the the second row, but generally falling back to that 3rd row in regards for those GP races and having to really fight and try to keep up with the top teams. He had 1 DNF in the sprint race and 3 in the GP races. And here we can compare, Lewis Hamilton to Charles Leclerc in those 6, sprint races and where they finished up. And so, we want to have that downward trend because that means you're finishing up into the top positions. And so we can see that Lewis Hamilton started off fairly strong, but ended up going backwards throughout the season, having that upward trend line, which is not a good thing. It means he's falling back into those positions on finishing those sprint races, where Charles Leclerc was pretty level, but he was slightly increasing throughout this season. Had that really good run in China, but then had an off in Miami, but came back for those next 3, and then ended up fairly poorly in Qatar as well. And here we're comparing Lewis Hamilton against Kimi Antonelli and Charles Leclerc, the people that or the drivers who finished around him in these drivers' championship. And so you basically are throwing Kimi Antonelli into the mix here and figuring out how he compared to Lewis Hamilton, the driver that he replaced at that Mercedes team, of course. And so you can kind of get an idea of how those cars related to each other, as well as the drivers in the standings. And you can see that, of course, Kimi has a much steeper, trend line, which means he was getting better throughout the year, kind of getting into that from that rookie standpoint, getting used to the Mercedes team, and then increasing as he got more confident in that team, even though he was, had some mistakes throughout this season. And here we're basically looking at Charles Leclerc and comparing him against Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, those drivers that finished around him in those sprint races. And so here you can kind of get a better idea of where Charles Leclerc ended up with George Russell, who joined this comparison here in that regard, in that Aqua. So you can see that Aqua is getting better, and so that Mercedes is getting better. And in that season-wise compared to the Ferrari and how they were dealing with those sprint races. And of course, you can see a little bit of the ups and downs that they had in Belgium for most of those drivers. But again, they were coming back fairly strong in those races where Ferrari was lagging back just a little bit. And here we see the GP races and comparing those Ferrari drivers. So we have Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc in these GP races and comparing them against each other. And I kind of like these kind of graphs where they match up a little bit more regularly across the season. That way you can compare the two drivers as the cars should be the same through each of those races. And you can see where the Ferrari had issues, on the racetracks comparatively, and where they were good at. And you can kind of look at those and kind of give you an idea of how well Lewis Hamilton was compared against Charles Leclerc across the season. And again, here we're comparing Lewis Hamilton with Charles Leclerc and Kimi Antonelli. Those drivers have finished around Lewis Hamilton in those drivers' championship. And so here you can kind of get a better idea of how well those fit in. And of course, we kind of better look at just the two Ferrari drivers that were right next to each other in the drivers' championship. So we throw Kimi Antonelli in the mix here in the Aqua, so you can kind of figure out that he had a few issues in that mid-season area where he was kind of having a poor performance, doing very well. But it came back in that second half of the season. And that trend line kind of shows you that as well, where that would start off not so good behind both the Ferrari drivers, but ended up getting better throughout the season and passing Hamilton on that trend line, saying that he was going to be better at that spot in time, and roughly how that was playing out throughout the season. And you can kind of compare race by race and figure out potentially where the Mercedes had better running than the two Ferrari drivers as they kind of match up in this lineup. And we compare Charles Leclerc with Lewis Hamilton and George Russell for those people that finished around him in the drivers' championship. So here you're basically throwing George Russell into the mix and seeing where he finished up. Now, of course, that trend line is pretty steady, but it's of course below what the trend line is for Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton as well. So overall, he's doing a much better job finishing up closer to the front. And you can kind of look at those where he finishing positions on those races and kind of tell that right off the bat there. And he was pretty consistent across the board, across the season. Yes, he had a couple of mistakes here and there, that kind of hurt him a little bit. But overall, he was really consistent, really doing a good job in that, fifth position, fourth position markers right across the season. And you compare that to Charles Leclerc, who was going ahead of him occasionally, but basically generally behind him on most cases. And you kind of get that idea of how well those two drivers were fighting it out on track. And here we have a nice graph of the points scored across the season between the two Ferrari drivers and where they were ending up against each other. So you can basically see that Hamilton here in yellow started off okay, but it was kind of getting worse, and that trend line shows that across the board. Not quite getting as many points at the end of the season, so he wasn't able to really grasp the development of that car as everybody else got better, and they were trying to tweak that Ferrari, where Charles Leclerc was a little bit more steady across the board, pretty even though he was getting kind of better at the end, but just slightly as that trend line was going up, which means he's getting more points at the end of the season than he was at the beginning of the season. And here we see that same data just put into a stat graph format, so you can kind of see the ebbs and flows of how those two teammates were getting points across the board comparatively each other, and which one was actually winning out over the other. So you can see that early on they were fairly competitive in between the Australia and China races, but then they started getting a gap from Japan forward, where Charles Leclerc was able to edge out Lewis Hamilton and gain that gap by the end of the season. And here we dive a little bit more into the team-wise and where they get the points in those sprint races. compared to those teams around them. So we're comparing Ferrari against Williams and Red Bull, and kind of compare those three teams and figure out what the trend lines were saying for those sprint races per se. So you can see that Ferrari, started off really strong, getting a lot of points, in China, but by the end of the season in those cutter, sprint race, they weren't getting any points whatsoever. So you can see that trend line going down, which is a bad thing. Where you also see Williams climbing a little bit, so getting slightly better, but Red Bull having a nice, good trend line going up means they're getting a lot more points at the end of the season than they were at the beginning, and you can kind of see how that plays out as well. And for those same sprint races, we can look at that as a step graph and kind of see the ebbs and flows where Ferrari was ahead of Red Bull for most of the season, but near the very end of the season, basically Red Bull was able to overtake him in those sprint race, point-wise, and then Williams was lagging behind quite a bit. And here we're just looking at the GP races and the points scored on what race, and so we can kind of look at those trend lines there and kind of figure out how things were playing out. As Williams was pretty steady across the board at the bottom, getting a few points, but not quite getting as many as the Ferrari or Red Bull team. And then you have the Ferrari teams getting slightly worse throughout the season, getting slightly less points at the end of the season than they were at the beginning. And then, of course, Red Bull, starting off a little bit slower, but gaining ground throughout the season, throughout those GP races, where they really found their footing and kind of started coming out with some of those updates and getting, Max Verstappen getting really pushing pretty hard to end up trying to potentially beat the Drivers' Championship for the year. But that didn't quite work out for them. But compared to the Red Bull, they were really doing well. And this is that step graph of that same data for the GP races. And so you can kind of look at that and see, again, Williams kind of lagging behind a little bit. They were ahead of Ferrari at the beginning, but didn't stay there very long, where Red Bull and Ferrari were kind of entwined in a mix. So the Red Bull started off stronger, but then kind of fell back in that mid-season issues where, falling behind Ferrari, then came back at the end of the season where Ferrari kind of lagged off just a little bit, where still Red Bull was able to pull out some good points and take that lead. And this is time to play the memory game, or spot what was different between this graph and the GP graph that we showed earlier, because this one concludes the sprint races. So this is including all of the points in each of those races. And so there was a few of those sprint races that were pushed in a little bit, and so you kind of figure out if those sprint races really made a difference overall in the point scheme of things, since there were just those few points that were being handed out. And so you can basically see, if you really get close in depth, that the crossover point between Red Bull and Ferrari kind of moved from that, Spain over down to that Canada marker-ish aspect of it. So slightly one race that that trend line kind of moved across. But other than that, basically, it's kind of a repeat of kind of what we've already seen. And this is that step graph format for that same data. So we kind of look at here and kind of figure out where those sprint races helped out. And that basically helped Ferrari stay ahead of the Red Bull just slightly in that Singapore-ish run, COTA run aspect of it. They were just edging out Red Bull in those, keeping ahead of them, but still fell behind by the end of the season. And that concludes our deep dive into Ferrari. We dove into where the team ended up and comparing around the team, constructor standings, around the teams that are around them, and the drivers around the Drivers' Championship that ended up in that running. If you like this kind of data, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe, so that maybe you will get a notification for next week's, where I dive into Red Bull and compare them around those teams that ended up at the end of the season near them. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.